Studies as its chairperson from January 2019 to 2023. Professor Singh is specialized in Indian aesthetics and poetics, Indian theory of theatre and performance, comparative poetry, Indian philosophy, and Indian philosophy of language, modern Irish literature, contemporary Irish poetry, modernist poetry, and Canadian fiction. Professor Singh has been invited to deliver talks and present papers in many international famed institutes organized in India and out of India. I'll just refer some of the places because the list is very long, like Germany, France, Italy. He has presented his research paper and he has delivered his invited talk. Uh, his research papers on language, literature, and other areas of cultural studies have been published by prestigious publications such as Palgrave, Macmillan, Springer Nature, Sahitya Akademi, and Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. Professor Singh has authored monographs, fables in the Indian narrative tradition. His forthcoming book is Philosophy of Performance in India from Bloomsbury. He has been visiting professor at University of Bergamo, Italy, Grinnell College, USA. All in all, the list is very long. I can say only that Professor Singh has a scintillating career. His achievements are staggering. His talent is multifaceted. He is laudable for his simplicity and amicability. He is profusely enlivened with large-heartedness. Without taking much time, now I humbly request sir for his deliberation. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those kind words. Um, Professor Maya Shankar Pandey ji, Dr. Lucy Guest, Dr. Patricia Austin, Dr. Mishra, Shri Ajit Kumar Singh ji, Professor K. M. Pandey, Professor Pawa, my colleague from and friend Dr. Lati, Dr. Mahima Singh, legal sisters and here, and colleagues, friends, students, scholars. This is indeed a very good feeling to be here at the college. And I must also remember the principal of the college, Professor Singh, Dr. Singh, with whom I had some interaction online during the COVID. And I congratulate the college for organizing this conference on culture studies, right? Culture, language, literature, and media. As Dr. Mishra just talked about, there have been serious thinking, reflection, academic action in terms of creation and dissemination of frameworks on what is broadly understood and accepted as culture studies across the country, especially in the last, let's say, 60, 70 years. We've been doing that in India as well. So these are big, great names, obviously, Adorno, Horkheimer, the Frankfurt School, Foucault, Stuart Hall. And the basic idea is this, that culture is a sphere of contestation. That there are dominant groups, cultural representation, language, instruments are created and owned by the dominant groups, and they're marginalized groups. And so culture is a sphere of constant contestation. In India, recently, something happened, and that which has been widely talked about has become subject of conference, seminars, workshops, and that is the National education policy 2020. And it's the, I must say, it's the only policy post independence India. There are two policies in this country. One, of course, by Mahmoud, and one by. Why is it two policy? Because the objective of any policy is to give a certain firm shape to thinking of people who go to schools and colleges. Macaulay gave that policy, of course, as all of us know, in the 1833 minutes, that India, of course, Arabia, or the non-West, doesn't have knowledge, doesn't have the language that can be counted as serious discourses that can lead to progress and development of human criticality or critical thought. Neither the language nor the discourse or knowledge of human civilization. That is the prerogative and the exclusive possession of the West. And therefore, all knowledge and learning, not only in Sanskrit, but also in Indian Bhasha. Macaulay, of course, also talks about the fact that it's impossible to translate from English also to the many Indian languages, especially Bengali, Marathi, that were becoming very important, popular then, because these languages did not have equivalent concepts, obviously, equivalent ideas that were in English. So that was one policy. The second policy, this new education policy, which of course lays great emphasis on Indian ways of thinking, what is usually termed as Indian knowledge systems. That's where I want to begin from. So let us look at the first word, culture. Culture studies. As I said, therefore, culture is a sphere of contestation, inequality, right? Subjugation, ideological clash, but as was pointed out by Dr. Mishra, as Gramsci calls hegemony, right? Direct coercion, indirect coercion, right? Isn't it? Sort of creating a consciousness that is favorable to the powers of the groups that dominate, obviously. What's the meaning of the word that we have in India is Sanskriti. Sanskriti is the word that we have in India. I'll largely talk about what is usually termed as pre-modern mostly by Western scholars, but rather I would like to call it non-modern because it's not a temporal category. Look at all the literature that is composed in Indian languages. By Indian languages, I do not mean the 28 scheduled languages, but roughly 1500 languages in which we have Sahitya or Vangmaya. Again, the word literature is severely limited. I'll come to literature later, and before that, I'll come to language. So, roughly 1500 languages. I had the opportunity, of course, of working with my guru, Professor on the project of international Indian poetics. And I must say also that Honorable Maya Shankar Pandeyji was the examiner of my PhD thesis. So I also hold him in the same regard. So I had the opportunity of working for Sahitya Akademi on a project on Indian poetics. So various Indian languages, oral languages, obviously, languages without a script. This is also a question that needs discussion, perhaps in a different context. Have literature, have compositions, of course, right? I'll come to that part later on, literature, language, culture. So culture is Sanskriti. Sanskriti, of course, if you look at the etymology of Sanskriti and the way, one of the meanings, so the core meanings of Sanskriti is this evolution from sanskara. That's right. Sanskara, Sanskriti. Sanskara is also evoked by Bhattalolat, one of the commentators of Bharatanatyam Shastra. He also uses another term for Vasana. And he uses the term Vasana and Sanskara in a specific context. And that context is that if one is watching theatre or performance, musical performance or theater performance, why is it that one responds in a certain way? In other words, our response to aesthetic literary events, or especially performance, doesn't have an analytical cause or content. So why is it that one actually responds in a certain way? There is a universal experience when one is actually watching a play or theater, and why does that happen? And therein comes the discussion about sanskara and vasana. So sanskara to Sanskriti, which of course means that at the root of literary and linguistic experience is consciousness. That is something that we need to think about in the Indian context. More or less also in the South Asian, if you take Southeast Asian culture traditions. Students of modern theater would know, I beg your pardon for this allusion or this reference. When I say India and Southeast Asia, one of the most remarkable revolutionary, if I can use the word that way, or radical thinker in modern Western theater or theater thinking or theater practice was Anatoly Artaud, as some of you might have read, of course, those who are students of theater. The French thinker, actor, playwright, writer, practitioner, Anatoly Artaud, The Theater and the Double is his book. The Theater and Double gave an entirely different is not an appropriate word, radically revised the way theater was taught in the West. One of the arguments that he makes is this, that theater has its own language. And the language of theater is different from the language of the text, which is in your hand. Once the text actually manifests on the stage, it becomes something else. And there the role of body becomes very, very important. Many of us talk about body in theater. Now that radical thinking in Artaud came from an experience of watching a Balinese theater in Paris, because both England and France, they used to hold this exhibition of arts and all in the colonies. And in one of these exhibitions in theater, that he comes to have this experience. Now that has radically revised the way theater was thought about. There, consciousness plays a great role. Language other than the language that we can speak in normal discourse becomes important. I'll come to this point when I come to language later on. So by culture, we mean this. That's what I want to stress, and I'll take this forward from here. The next term, of course, is language, right? And then it's literature. When we come to discuss language in relation to literature and literature in relation to media, let me make my conclusive point here, and then I'll go and repeat. What I want to say is this, with my limited understanding, that when we come to media, let me take the last word, media, and of course, the sort of importance of media, especially cinema, obviously, cinema, photography, newspapers, obviously, print media, happens at a very important stage in the West, of course. There's a great impact in India as well. And Walter Benjamin was being talked about, work of art in the age of mechanical production. That work by Benjamin has a great impact. And one of the arguments that he makes is almost similar argument that Virginia Woolf makes in her essay, The Cinema. Is this that what cinema does, or what media does, is this, that it makes reproductivity possible, that the images of art, the representation of art are not sacrosanct, are no longer sacrosanct. They do not have the print of authenticity, ownership of a particular author. But with the coming of technology, of course, their reproductivity, they being reproduced many a time that becomes possible, and that is something the strength of media. Virginia Woolf therefore finds problem with that. My point is this: that when we look at India today in the 21st century, and especially in the context of literature and media is returning. In case of cinema or YouTube, social media, the images that circulate on social media, it is returning in a way, interestingly though, and ironically though, what can be termed as the postmodern phase, right? It is returning to us a core aesthetic, linguistic, literary, cultural aspect of Indian thinking in these areas, which of course again in Bharata's Natya Shastra is the Shravya Drishya, that art, literature is at the same time to be received through the senses of hearing and sight. The senses of hearing and sight. And when you talk of senses of hearing and sight, what we mean is the importance of performance. One would surprise to know that, especially in the context when we say that media discourses, media images, media narratives, media representations in the world of post-truth that has been talked about, there is a wider circularity, there is wider repetitions, obviously. There is willful interventions. There is willful interventions, obviously, modifications as such, distortions as such. Now, this is what in a similar language that Abhinav Gupta talks about in his commentary on Bharata's Natya Shastra, that there is no original performance. There's no original performance. I'm trying to link all this, and this is something important for us in the context that when we talk of our experience, our representations, dissemination of these representations, discussions, critical thinking, we and especially the students, we have to think what are the sources in our own tradition. That's what is important. That is why I'm making these comparisons. Abhinav makes that statement in his commentary on Natya Shastra, that there is no original performance. In fact, there can never be an original performance. There's a different context to it. There's no time for here. I don't think there's a question-answer thing, but if there's time, one can think about it. But that's Abhinav Gupta. Now let me come to language, literature. Now, what is language? Now, and language cannot be in literature. Language cannot be dissociated with orality. We are primarily an oral culture. All native cultures, indigenous cultures are primarily oral culture. Oral culture, not because there was no writing, there was no script. It's not because there's no script. Panini, of course, talks about both script and writing, 9th century BCE. Atarya, Aranyak, where, because if you talk of the Vedas, you have the mantras, of course, then you have Brahmanas, Aranyaks, and you have Upanishads. Traditionally, Aranyaks were the texts that were composed in the forest, of course, after reflection, and then they led to the Upanishads. There's a reference which says that a student, before studying, should not indulge in various other things. And one of the things that a student should not indulge is in writing. Therefore, it is not that writing was not available. Therefore, orality, orature has a primacy. Orality has a primacy because of certain accepted, ingrained elements of the culture, which is a different mode of knowledge creation, knowledge reception, knowledge retention, and knowledge dissemination. Right? So, we don't have time for it, but is there a way in which we can relate what do we mean by language to what is literature? Both oral literature and what comes to be written literature later on. There's a great deal of thinking in India on language, both in the Upanishadic tradition As also in Buddhist tradition, for instance, there is a debate between Bhartari and Debnag in the 6th century CE. Very important debate. Debate on the relationship between word and meaning. Obviously, the Buddhists would question any association of word, meaning, and the thing, which comes much later. Let me make another deviation here. One of the major developments in Western philosophy, Western thinking, was the linguistic turn that was introduced by Ferdinand de Saussure in the 20th century. Linguistic turn, which was basically a concept in language and linguistics, which actually stressed upon the fact with an argument, a solid argument and logic, that language is not simply a means of communication, but language constructs reality. From the linguistic turn, the concept of linguistic turn, which was borrowed by all different fields in social sciences and humanities, whether it's gender studies, whether these are studies on the caste, whether these are studies on tribes, the idea that all identities are constructed. Identities are constructed. There's no given identity as such, and are constructed by a language or discourse in the interest of the dominating power. The dominant power could be a state, could be other power structures. Interestingly, of course, as many of you know, that Saussure was borrowing this idea from Sanskrit, from Bhartari primarily. Keeping it aside, when we discuss language, and especially language in relation to literature, I would like to draw your attention to few lines, of course, from the Upanishads, but of course it comes from the Vedas, the Rig Veda, which of course says that in the translation it says that language cuts forms in the vast ocean of reality. Mandukya Upanishad, of course, statement comes which says that, and this has great value for music. This is a great value for music and great value for literature. What it says is this, and it's important for us to read this text. Reading this text on language and literature makes us critically free, critically independent to literature and texts that are coming from elsewhere. It's important for us not to be simply a data to the theory that comes from elsewhere. It makes us independently thinking people. And on another occasion, I can give you 100 examples some other time. All literary theory and cultural theory that has come in the last 50 years, all these theories have aimed at destabilizing societies by creating differences. Now, all literature talks about differences. You have some great people here, Rabindranath Tagore, right? You have Premchand, right? You have Ghalib. They've all represented experiences of pain and suffering. But the end of this, having an amelioration, right? Overcoming changes in society. The aim of literature has never been pitting one community against the other. Gender studies. I know I have some friends, I can see them here, and they may pardon me. Gender studies, of course, talk of all phases of feminism, right? All of us are right from Ellen Showalter to that theory, Julia Kristeva, womanism. That she makes, what's the name of the text where she talks about? Anyway, forget it. Women's time. So it started with political liberation of women. And then to the sense that, and there are a lot of French thinkers, obviously. And the idea that the first discourse is limited because this is about primarily about white women. And therefore, Kristeva coming with the fact that rather than feminism, which is rooted in one center, obviously, about one woman, right? There are black women rights, and there's a different language in which those are expressed. And then as we go ahead, that also gets severely questioned. Then the question of women's body, then the question of women's language in universalist terms. And there is a great deal of social, political, discursive, intellectual, literary uh, movement and attitude to gain freedom for women, right? And freedom for women is understood in language and terms that is borrowed from modernity. That we are moving in a linear transaction from pre-modern to modern society, and all ideas that have scientific basis, that are progressive in the moment, would lead to the freedom of women. And then we are here late 20th century, 21st century, where you say that we need to respect the cultural values of some communities. So we want freedom for others, but for some community sensitivities have to be respected. And you use that argument now to support violence, and then say that is an equal cause for us. Is to play discourse in societies. The theories, literary theories, have been used, have come from certain locations, have come primarily from America, and they have been exported. There is an essay by J. Hillis Miller, all of you might have read that, right? They were exported to create discourse in societies, because that ultimately serves the purpose of global capitalism. This is very interesting in a way, because India should remain a market. If India should merely remain, I know I'm making a political statement here, I might get a political academic statement, I must say. India should remain a market. If India has to remain a market, then India must be a site of disturbance, where communities are pitted against one against other. There are differences of caste, there are differences of classes, there are differences of religion. And then they become, it remains only a market for the powers which are in the West. People like Gramsci, they've themselves talked about, Foucault he himself has talked about, that these are all discourses. One is to understand that to which end is it serving. When we talk of, let's say, feminism, don't we have, and I'm not saying that as students of world literature and world culture, we should not be studying or thinking or talking about these things. We must. But from what perspective? That is what is important. That is what is important. We have example, for instance, the theory women of Buddha's Therigatha, 6th century BCE. If you read some of the poems in the Therigatha, Sumedha, one of the poet, there's a great deal of critique of the language that what is usually termed as the patriarchal society uses. There's a great deal of thinking there, of questioning differences, but questioning differences with an understanding that is far more constructive, looks at a future where literature serves the purpose. After all, whether it's the classical Greeks or our ancestors, literature is a different purpose. Literature's purpose is different than that of other discourses in the social sciences. Now, Kautilya's Arthashastra. Kautilya Arthashastra, I'm referring to Arthashastra because we have a great intellectual tradition. And in the intellectual tradition, what is important, of course, is this, that there's a multidisciplinarity, no doubt there's a multidisciplinarity, but the objective of literature or Sahitya or Vangmaya is a word for literature in India, is understood as different. The goal is rasa anubhati. That's what is the goal of literature. The goal of literature is not to be understood strictly in Brechthian terms, whether in India or in any traditional societies. So what is it? how do we understand a language in relation to literature and the media? There have been a great deal of thinking, but the primary framework is this. Primary framework about language and literature is this. And this has come to have a discussion in the 20th century, 19th century, especially the French symbolists have discussed this. Also because there was a great deal of influence of Indian philosophy on 19th century philosophers like Nietzsche and others, various others, obviously, a great deal of influence. Schopenhauer was one of them. That beside the point here. The idea is this, that in linguistic discourses, what is language and what is literary language, what is the language of literature, has been significant. As far as language is concerned, and I'm referring to Bhartrhari here, Bhartrhari, who influenced Saussure, who was teaching Sanskrit at the University of Geneva. In his book, as you know, the course in gender linguistics is not a book but a course book, right? A course in gender linguistics, in English we call it. In French it's a different term. So it's a course, it was his lectures that were compiled by students, and that's why it's called course in gender linguistics. In Bhartrhari, if you go by Bhartrhari, and I was trying to quote from Mandukya Upanishad, what I was trying to quote is similar to what Bhartrhari argues. Mandukya Upanishad says that a language has 4 parts. Shabda. Shabda ka bhi translation to hai nahi, there is no translation of Shabda. Shabda has 4 aspects, or Shabda has 4 parts. Human beings can utter. Now there is a different version. One version says human beings can utter and listen to 3 parts of Shabda. One part is inaudible, cannot be spoken. Another version says that human beings can utter 1 part of the 4-part Shabda. 3 parts cannot be uttered or spoken. The part that is spoken and can be heard is contingent to the influence of the phenomenal world. And phenomenal world, there are different conditions, obviously. There are physical conditions. Now, but the essential thing to understand here in this theory is this, that the part that cannot be uttered in the 4-part word or Shabda, word is again not the translation of Shabda, because Shabda is consciousness in Bhartrhari. The part that cannot be uttered and the part that cannot be heard is the part that constitutes the meaning. That's what it is. To repeat, a word has 3 parts that can be heard. The word has 1 part that can be heard. 3 parts cannot be heard. 1 part cannot be heard. But the part that cannot be heard is the one that surrounds the rest of the parts, and that is the one that constitutes meaning. What is essentially is this, that therefore there is no intrinsic relation between word and meaning. In language or in literature, we are all the time seeking to reach out to the meaning. And that is the root of performance. That is the root of performance. In performance, body becomes important. Why is body important? I'm quoting people like Abhinav Gupta, I'm quoting people like Bharata, I'm quoting people like Bhattanayaka. Body becomes important in performance. In dance, Natya therefore is a primary form of art and literature in India. Is important. It's important because there is a serious limitation to language. For this, you don't need to go to Derrida. You should read Derrida, but with the belief that, well, I am dealing with Derrida at an equal front. Therefore, there is an impossibility of reaching to, impossibility of experiencing. Experiencing is the right word. Impossibility of experiencing the meaning with the words that I can speak or the words that I can hear. Therefore, we need something else. Even if, as I'm saying this, my hands are moving, because there is a subconscious reality that this is not enough. Therefore, I immediately, in subconscious level, I bring my body. And that is the origin of dance. And therefore, in India, Nritya and Natya have same etymology. Now, that is the crux of Bhartrhari. That Shabda and Shabda. If you students of literature, I think so, English department, obviously, you might have read Jacques Lacan. These are very important names. Usually in JNU, when I teach these courses, I first take these names when I'm teaching the Indian courses so that people know that there's something important that's coming up. Jacques Lacan, in one of the essays, in fact, refers to Abhinav Gupta and Anandavardhana. In Acritus, if you have that collection of essays, he refers to Anandavardhana and Abhinav Gupta. But there was a point that I want to say, it is just going off my mind, but where was I was talking of language, of course, and I was talking of the separation, obviously, yeah. But in a specific way, I had brought in Jacques Lacan. What was the thing that I had in mind when I brought him? Brought Jacques Lacan. But anyway, let's forget it. If I remember, I'll come to it later on. How much time do I have? Maybe 10 minutes more? Yeah, or 5 minutes more? 5-6 minutes. Okay. So the point I'm trying to say is this, that there's an understanding. Yes. I got it now. So in Lacan, you have, of course, the other with capital O and the other with small o. Those students of literature may have read this. Bhartrhari, of course, uses shabda. And there are two. By shabda, he means two things. One shabda is a shabda that I speak. You may see with small s, and there's other shabda, is that consciousness, is the shabda consciousness, which music makes possible. Music makes possible that shabda. And all literature, therefore, is an effort to reach out to that shabda. Therefore, there is an intrinsic relation between shabda, between language and literature, in the way it is thought of as different from other discourses. I was referring to Kautilya's Arthashastra some time back. Kautilya's Arthashastra, like any other text in the Indian intellectual tradition, makes it important that all discourses are actually oriented towards the four goals of life, mainly the first three goals of life, dharma and kama, all of them. One of them, of course, and they of course modify. So Kautilya, of course, as you know, Arthashastra is a text on polity, it's also a text on niti, it's also a key text on economics. And the point that he makes here is this, that he coins a term called danda, and the term for danda, and the translation of danda is usually done as punishment, which is not the right translation. What it means is law. That's what it means. So he connects dharma with law. In all other discourses, you know that dharma is a key word. People generally, of course, and I'm relating to media, there's a lot of discussion about post-truth. There's a lot of discussion about flurry of narratives, flurry of points of view, flurry of narratives about what exactly happened, especially in the realm of social media. If you look at one of the ingrained understanding in these texts, there is no question. In fact, this question of having multiple narratives don't bother them. Why? Because for them, for these thinkers, for the early Indian thinkers, what is important is whether dharma, artha, especially dharma, primarily dharma is followed or not. Which of course to be translated as Lok Samgraha in Gita or in Buddha. Buddha also talks about Lok Samgraha. If every narrative, there's an event and then there's a narrative. And if the narrative is not controlled, but if the narrative is motivated, inspired by dharma, by social welfare, by the good cause, then it doesn't matter whether the narrative is a true representation of what happened or not. It's, in fact, in the Indian thought, if you look at the philosophical text, the very word that we have for philosophy is darshan. And darshan means, of course, point of view. Darshan means perspective. Darshan, the very term darshan, has in it an idea that there cannot be absolute truth. There have to be many truths, various truths. But all truth and narratives, if they're shaped by good cause, greater cause, dharma, it doesn't matter whether something happened this way or that way. That is what shapes Indian literature. And here I mean literature, whether literature is in social science literature, or it's what is termed as Vangmaya. In Kautilya in Arthashastra, of course, make law supreme. He makes law supreme, but he subsumes dharma in law. The difference between literature and other discourses, of course, social science especially, and I'm again referring to Abhinav Gupta, what he states is this, that whereas other literature, means social sciences basically, Dharma Shastras for instance, or Niti Shastras for instance, the objective of these discourses, of course, is dissemination of understanding, dissemination of knowledge as such. The objective of literature is experience. Now, experience not in a very simple sense. What he means is this. What the term that is used is sakshatkar. Sakshatkar is a term that he uses there. That literature makes it possible for us to experience as if what is being represented, the reader or the audience is experiencing firsthand. That is what literature makes possible. And that is a primary difference between literature, literary discourses, and other discourses. Media discourses, whether it's cinema, we have a history of cinema in India. There have been great movies, of course, right from the 60s, 50s, 60s, even before that. And cinema in India has been closely associated with the nation making. Mother India, Mother India was Mehboob Khan's response to a very pejorative book about India, as many of you know. And throughout, especially 16th, 70s and 80s, and even in contemporary times, cinema has been closely associated with making the Indian audience experience the many rasas of Natyashastra. I have, of course, a paper on rasa and Indian cinema. Now, that is what cinema makes possible. That is what the discourses that circulate in media makes possible. That is why media is dangerous as well. Literature is dangerous as well. I mean, I'm using in a very, within quote, of course. I don't mean that literally, of course. What I mean is this, that literature has a greater impact on society, on people, than a text in political science has, political science or history does. History, of course, all narratives of history gets discussed and debated in the university halls, in learned gatherings, learned within quote again. Once it reaches through social media, through cinema, of course, there's a great, and therefore movies are banned. Books are also banned, but the impact of literature is far greater. Why is the impact of literature far greater? The impact of literature is far greater. The impact of media is far greater because it has an ability to color the consciousness. Because literature, media, uses a different language, whether it is a language that we speak and hear, or is a language that is in form of moving images of cinema or social media. It has an ability to directly, I'm using in a very simple sense, directly affect human consciousness, which literary, non-literary, political, even historical, sociological discourses cannot. You know, you come out of a cinema, and it disturbs you. It changes your mind in a certain ways. And therefore, there's a greater responsibility to as far as literary critics are concerned, literary scholars are concerned, cultural scholars are concerned, to think about the greater good, and perhaps some sort of a transcendence from what Abhinav Gupta would call one's severe limitations in time and space. We are severely limited by time, space, and identity. What is identity? After, I think I don't have time, but identity discourses are also in a way pretty limited. They serve their important political purposes. I must accept that. But what I'm trying to say is this, that once they become For instance, you can be, I don't want to make statements which are a little problematic, but then you can be a great, consider a great writer, go outside India and say, India mein to ye ho raha hai, India mein to ye ho raha hai, ye ho raha hai wahan pe. I was talking about somebody in the morning with Professor Pawa. The greater responsibility, I'll give an example of Seamus Heaney. Seamus Heaney. Seamus Heaney is one of my favorite poets. I teach Seamus Heaney in JNU. And my favorite poet also because he was a son of a farmer. I am a son of a farmer. And therefore, when I read the poem Digging, of course, it had a great impact on my life. It also reminded me of my village school where I started in Bihar. So my favorite poet, Seamus Heaney, was a Catholic. Seamus is a Catholic from Northern Ireland, from Derry. It would have been very easy for Seamus Heaney to take a Catholic position, to take a Northern Irish position, to write against the British occupation, right? He of course wrote against British occupation, but to write against the Protestants in Northern Ireland. But it was very difficult for him, very painful for him. In many of his writings, he calls writing as suffering, and I have an unpublished essay on writing as suffering in Seamus Heaney. The writing involves a great deal of suffering because your own limited experiences calls out, tells you to take a position, take a political position, take a position against the Protestants. But you know that the Catholics in Northern Ireland have also been involved in violence against the Protestant community. Therefore, you can't take a stand. All great writers, therefore, all great reflective writers, not writers who want easy residences in London, elsewhere in Europe, they will be welcome there because they are the ones who are sowing the seed of disintegration in the Indian society. That serves some purpose. And ultimately, that serves the purpose of capitalism. That's what I'm trying to say. Not those writers, but writers with great deal of sensibility. Every word uttered. I'm amazed at the kind of intellectuals and so-called progressives, the statement that actually came on the violence and bombardment the other day attacking the children and women in Israel. But it didn't shock me. As a writer, as a thinker, there's a great deal of responsibility, and the responsibility is towards a greater good of humanity. And that is why language in relation to literature in relation to media assumes a greater responsibility for all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Dhananjay, for contextualizing the idea of cultural studies in Indian context. And yes, media and cinema, they do reproduction, and probably via technology and going back to the tradition, probably one may identify the politics of available narratives. And you very well placed concept of language in the context of Indian epistemology. Thank you, sir.